Hey, Don.
Hey there. So does anybody know how to automatically admit people so that I don't have to keep.
I
Mhm.
think it's there should be a button right there that says admit all.
It does, but there's also a way to not have a waiting room.
Oh,
So I
I don't
think
know
what I
how to
need.
set that up in Zoom.
Okay, I did it last month and now I can't remember. So I'll just keep going. Cool. Well, we'll give it a few minutes for folks to show up. I like your background, Tracy. Did you take that picture?
I stole it off Bing. It's a Bing background.
Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Goodness, this is a slow start today.
Nice
So how's
outside.
everyone?
Everybody's outside.
Yeah, trying to get caught up after all the bee tasks, right?
Man.
So much. Yeah.
Hey, Brian.
Hello, I will be making dinner while you speak.
Nice. What are we having?
Oh, I don't want to talk about it. It's a Blue Apron. We do Blue Apron. It's worked really well for us. It's the right portion, and it's less decisions.
A lot of my friends really like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I took the waiting room off of the participants. So folks will be coming in as they come in, but I don't have to keep looking over and be distracted. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and whoever's late is going to miss the first part. So it's recorded. They can come back and watch it, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, welcome. Oh, you know who's not here yet? Drat. Maybe we shouldn't start. The owl's not here.
Oh, that's weird. Who's running that?
Yeah. Well, that's Brian, and I think Kit is at the other meeting spot. Shoot. Oh, here we go. No. So I'm going to send Brian a note. Oh, wait, who was it? Kit? How about Bruce? I'll try. Oh, for those of you who aren't familiar, we just started using an owl at the last meeting and it worked fantastic. We really, really liked it. And now it's missing. I don't know, it should be signed in. So we've got a group of people in a room somewhere who are waiting to join the meeting. I'm hoping that the room wasn't locked or the owl's not working or something, because we were trying to get more people to go to the live portion. Ah, heck. Okay, well, I wonder if Jeff is, hey, Jeff, have you heard anything about the owl? Has anybody pinged you or Kathleen?
I have no information about the owl.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and Oh, you don't have, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start. We just can't postpone any longer. Hopefully the room shows up. Hi, Kathy. Okay, so as you can see, this is our second meeting with an owl, our second hybrid meeting. The last one went really well. The sound quality and being able to see everybody, I just thought was fantastic. So clearly we're having some kind of either technical or facility challenges today, and I'm sure we'll find out soon enough what they are. But welcome to the meeting. The live portion tonight is at the Center for Urban Horticulture, which is where we used to meet in that big room with the high ceilings. So the live portion is there. Oh, I bet that's what it is we got all set up for the wisteria room. And maybe we hadn't set up for this other room. That's probably what it is. Oh, I'm so sorry. There's panicked people somewhere. Panicked people somewhere trying to get into the meeting. They can all come in through their phones if they need to. But we will be back to the wisteria room next week. So this is just a one-time different room because the wisteria room was booked. So we had to go back to our old room again at the so we will be at the Graham Visitor Center again next month. So I was going to have a couple of words for the remote people, which we don't have here. So if you are on Zoom and you are looking for a mentor, or if you are interested in mentoring someone, why don't you go ahead and drop your name into chat and some kind of contact information. So if you're willing to mentor and it's okay with you if people text you, go ahead and drop that in there. This is kind of the time of year when people really start getting a lot of questions. I mean, the install is done and the bees are building up and a lot of questions come on. You know something, Tracy? I'm taking your space. You
No,
should
go
step
ahead.
in and say,
You go.
oh, okay.
You go, girl.
Okay. So I'm just going to do a few minutes, and when I get to events, then I'll stop and you can jump in and then you can take over again. So if you have questions and you need a mentor, go ahead and put your name in chat. If you're too shy and you don't want to put your name in chat, remember, you can reach out to any neighborhood captain, not just the ones in your neighborhood. Just feel free to reach out. Sometimes we click with some people and not with others. So just don't be shy, ask questions, send texts. It's okay to send texts. I think pretty much all of the mentors and neighborhood folks are on text. Some more reliably than others. So that was my beginning intro comments. So now we have Tracy Klein here with our seasonal lesson. Take it away, Tracy.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off because I'm on an unreliable Wi-Fi and I don't want to max it out here. So stop video and then I'll share my screen. Come on. There it goes. Don, can you see that?
Yep, it's there.
Excellent. Well, everyone, the blackberries are blooming early this year. They haven't quite budded out like this yet, but all of mine are budded up next to my house. And so if yours aren't yet budded up, prepare. So this is the time when space management really becomes critical. So if you forget everything else I say today, remember these two things. You need to stay ahead of the space to put nectar in, also known as the super area or the spot on top. And you need to make sure that there's enough room for the queen to lay more eggs. People do make the mistake of they just add additional supers and then the bees swarm anyway. And they say, but I had lots of space. And unfortunately, the queen won't cross a honey barrier to go above that to lay eggs. So the problem lies in the fact that there's two things to manage and people only think about managing the one space, and that's the honey supers. So you need to manage the brood space as well. So things to consider in the brood area is to create space for the queen to continually lay eggs. So how do you do that? You can add an additional brood box in between your honey supers and the brood area. You can remove frames of capped honey and either extract those if you have an extractor or freeze them and store them for extraction later. Or you could give frames of capped brood and the adhering nurse bees to a smaller colony and switch the empty comb that you get from there into your bigger colony. And so that's probably the three main ways to make sure that that queen always has space to lay. If you have a big booming colony and you want to draw some extra wax, during the blackberry flow is the perfect time to do that, because there's lots of resources and they can really build wax very quickly during that blackberry flow. So here's a couple of pictures to give you the idea. Beginning beekeepers tend to make the mistake of thinking that bees like to socially distance like humans, and they don't. They like to have lots of them in close proximity to each other. And so on the left-hand side, you see the two boxes. One on the top is a nuke and the other one is a regular 10 frame box. And you would not add another box to these bees because they're not covering 70 to 80% of the space. But you definitely would add more space to the bees on the right-hand side, because they're definitely in the bottom box, they're covering 8 of the 10 frames, and in the top box, they're pretty crammed in there, and it's time to add more space. This time of year, you should be looking for swarm cells once a week. And the easiest way to do that is to just crack the box. If you have 2 deeps, you really only need to crack the top one up to look inside. If you have 3 mediums, you'll need to look in between both of those top boxes, the top box, and look in the bottom of that middle box too. And if your box looks like the one on the bottom left, those bees are going to swarm if they haven't already. And if you see this and there's capped or nearly capped swarm cells on the bottom, make sure that you do a split right away, or else your bees are going to end up in a tree somewhere. And this year, the bees are super swarmy. I've gotten a ton of swarm calls already. My friends on the swarm list say they've gotten lots of calls too. So it's important to make sure and do that. You'll probably hear on the Facebook forums and stuff about checkerboarding. And so I have this slide in here to show you what that looks like. Checkerboarding the honey super can help slow down that swarming urge, because the bees don't like the disorganization of having honey and then a non-drawn frame and then honey and then a non-drawn frame. They like everything neat and tidy and orderly before they swarm. So you can do this thing called checkerboarding. And so you see there's 4 brand new frames in there. I do use foundation. If you go foundationless, if you want to draw frame, if you want the bees to draw out the comb the way the beekeepers enjoy it, horizontally there, or vertically in this picture rather, make sure that you have fully drawn frames and with the other frame that you want drawn in the middle so they don't cross comb it. So this is checkerboarding. If you're adding another super, you would put the checkerboard the opposite direction, so it literally looks like a checkerboard. And most importantly, you'll see on the forums, people will say, oh yeah, checkerboard your brood space. Bad idea. That induces them to swarm. If you want to put 1 or 2 frames in between where they're raising brood, you can do that and get away with it, but you can't checkerboard the whole thing and reliably get away with that. The bees don't like that, and they'll swarm. Or a cold night will come along and some of the brood will get chilled. And during the blackberry flow, you want to have all hands on deck, because the more bees you have during the honey flow, the more honey you get. New beekeepers always ask me, should I feed 1-to-1 syrup if I put my supers on? And the answer is no. If you already have drawn comb, you don't need syrup during the blackberry flow. And if you're planning to sell your honey, you definitely don't want to be feeding, because people want to buy honey from nectar sources, not honey from the store, AKA sugar. There's nothing the matter with eating it, but that's not what they're purchasing. They're purchasing natural honey. But maybe, yes, you do want to have your feeders on with supers on too. If one, you're not selling your honey, and especially if you have only brand new frames up top there, it's not a bad idea to just spray those with a little bit of sugar syrup to start, and then to help entice them up into that box with undrawn comb. And at that point, I definitely would not have a queen excluder on, because it's harder to get them to draw wax above a queen excluder if there was no frames of drawn wax up there. Definitely do continue to feed them syrup though, until they get at least the brood area all drawn out. New beekeepers tend to stop feeding too soon, in my humble opinion, and then they end up bummed out because they didn't have enough wax, and that they didn't get any honey that year. So go ahead and give them a boost and keep feeding them syrup until your comb gets mostly drawn out. And then a quick word on queen excluders. If you like to have your honey super light, and the blackberry honey is very light and you can see through it really easily. If you have new comb and that stays nice and light, that doesn't have any brood ever raised in it, it will stay lighter. And the only way to do that is to go ahead and use a queen excluder. If you're new to beekeeping, forget about queen excluders for the first couple years. It makes management of the space for the brood area and the honey supers twice as complicated. So just skip this for now. But if you're listening and you're an intermediate beekeeper and you've run bees for a little while and you think, well, I'm going to try a queen excluder this year. My humble opinion is that those metal ones where the grooves go parallel with the frames, the bees can get through that a lot easier. The holes are bigger. They're longer and easier to get through, as opposed to those plastic ones where the grooves go the opposite direction. Combined with the frames, it makes the holes pretty tiny for them to be able to work through, and it's a lot more work for them to get up in there. So spend a little bit of extra money and get those metal ones with the holes going the right direction. And unfortunately, now's the time when the Varroa are really kicking into gear too. So I do recommend monitoring for mites once a month. And this is from previous slides, previous month's lessons. If you want to watch the YouTube video on how to do an alcohol wash or how to do a sugar shake, those are two pretty good sites. If you just want to use the sticky board method, I know somebody asked me last month how many, and so this is the answer to that question. If you have sticky boards, do a 24-hour count. And if you have 8 frames of bees or more, 8+ frames, and there you want to treat if there's more than 40 mites on that board after 24 hours. Or if you have less than 7 frames of bees, treat if there are 20 or more mites. And just a word on treatments, make sure that you're following the directions in the manufacturer's package insert, so that you don't accidentally kill bees or kill your queen in the process, which can be a real problem in August if you're using Formic Pro. So keep that in mind as the summer heats up. And that's all my slides. I'll stop sharing and then turn my camera back on and answer a few questions. Anybody have any questions?
So what should somebody do if they do find queen cells? And it looks like the owl is here. Hi guys, everybody at the university. Yay.
So Don asked a great question. What should I do if I see swarm cells? Well, if you see swarm cells and they haven't swarmed yet, I would definitely recommend doing a split. There's a million different ways to actually perform a split. The easiest is to divide your equipment and bees into equal parts and do what's called an equal split. My humble recommendation is, if you can find the queen, to put her in the new box, because that kind of simulates a swarm. If you put the queen in the new box, then the old box where the swarm cells are, they're like, oh, okay, they swarmed. We just didn't notice. But also what I do is I smash all but 2 of the swarm cells. 2 is plenty, and any more than that, they tend to have more than one queen emerge, and then you get swarms with virgin queens. And I've collected several swarms already this year with virgin queens in them, which happens when there's too many swarm cells in there. So make sure that you go through and smash all but 2 of those. And I usually, if there's frames with more than one, I smash all but 1 on that one, and then I pick another one on a different frame just so they're not right next to each other. I don't know if that works, but that's how I do it. Don, how do you do it?
Yeah, that's about how I do it. You also want to make sure that the cells are the same age. So you can look at them and they're either both fully capped, or after they're capped, the bees kind of go through and they start chewing the wax and thinning the edges so that the queen can emerge more easily. So you kind of want to look for the same level of thinning, because if you pick 2 cells that are significantly different ages, the first queen to come out is just going to kill that one, and you might as well just had one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And
And
so
I guess I want to
the other important thing is to make sure you have eggs in both boxes. If you can't find the queen, just make sure you have eggs in both boxes, and then go back after a week and see, then the one that they've built swarm cell or supersedure cells in is the one that's queenless, and then you want to do the same thing and smash all but 2 of those.
And there's adding in, there's a reason why it's good and important to check every single week during swarm season to make sure you don't have queen cells, is because you go in, let's say you go in on week 1 and they're doing something that's more like a supersedure cell where it comes out of the middle of the frame, and all that's in there so far is an egg, and it's an egg for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, the egg emerges and it becomes a larva, but the queen cell is capped on day 9. So if you're only checking every 14 days, then you can get a complete queen there and swarmed before you even check again. So it's even sometimes hard to catch them in 7 days, because they might swarm sometimes a day or so before the cell is capped. So check every week and keep your bees.
Yep. They're really swarmy this year, gang.
You guys have the floor.
5 people. Anybody?
I could ask a question. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. So I had a very tiny little hive over winter, and I checked, I don't know, 10 days ago or something like that. And there were 2 brood areas on 2 different frames, one like smaller than my hand and one maybe the size of a tennis ball. But I did see the queen, and they're fighting. I mean, they're trying so hard. So I took a frame of brood and the nurse bees, like one of your slides suggested, and I stuck it in there in between those 2 frames. And I have a feeder and some pollen on there. Am I concerned that I don't have enough foragers to feed all of that group that I just put in the box? Because there were not a lot of bees in that tiny colony.
Yeah, so long as you've got food inside the colony. So you said you've got your feeder on and a pollen patty, you did the right thing, and there's food that they can go get. You're right, they don't have enough foragers right now. So you did exactly what you should do.
Okay, cool.
Well done.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
Thanks.
And adding in, I always like to add in, so bear with me, adding in that you are feeding them, so you don't have to worry as much about forage. But when you donate a frame of brood to a small colony, you want to make sure it's capped brood, because capped brood has had all of those inputs put in already. It's like gold. Those little bees are going to emerge and start feeding everybody. They're just workers waiting to go. If you give a weak colony a frame of uncapped brood, it's like giving a whole bunch of mouths to feed to an already impoverished colony. So you want to make sure it's capped brood. The other thing is you want to keep those nurse bees on the frame. Just take the frame out of the one box, put it in the other, covered with bees. It's okay. The foragers will fly home and the nurse bees will stay there. There might be a little bit of fighting, but not enough to worry about. And the reason for that is when you look at your brood, you want to make sure that there's enough bees to cover the brood. And that way they keep them warm. Otherwise, what you wind up with is, if it's, as you see this, especially in the winter with a shrinking colony, is they can keep the brood in the middle warm, but then you have this round circle, what Dewey Karen calls the bathtub ring, of unemerged brood that died because it wasn't able to stay warm. So just make sure you have enough bees in there that to cover the ones you added.
That happens a lot in the spring. The other thing I probably would have done was just put the cap brood next to them. I probably wouldn't have split them, but I'd have put it right next to them. But I don't think it really matters. Kathy, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Thank you. I didn't hear you. Don't have my hearing aids in. The other thing that I like to do to avoid any loss of bees when you're taking a frame from one hive to give to a weaker hive is I give it a very light shake. The bees that fall off are the foragers. Then you're putting just nurse bees into that hive and there's less fighting. You don't want to have fighting because you have a weak hive. So you need every bee you got. So just give it just a light shake. That's all it takes. And those foragers just pop right off. And all the rest of them that are clinging are your nurses. Also, the nurse bees that are 5 to 15 days old are the ones that make wax and royal jelly. So if you're making a nuke, if you have to split and you're making a nuke, when that queen is born, give her a frame of cat bees from another hive or from a stronger hive so that she has a continual source of young bees to feed her, and your nuke will build much faster.
This is exactly why you want to have 2 colonies. If you get one and it's weak like that, you have no one to steal stuff from. So if you have 2, then chances are pretty good you're going to be able to replace the resources that the other one needs when things go bad, and they always go bad at some point.
Also, there's a trick for building up the hives, and when you get to the point where you are in a honey flow, that's when robbing starts. So you don't want to have a weaker hive and a stronger hive. You can swap positions, and the foragers coming into the weaker hive then are bringing in stuff, and they don't fight when they bring a hostess gift. They're just let right in. So that's another trick for equalizing your hives, which you want to think about doing pretty soon.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We have time for one more question. What are you guys seeing in your hives? Anything that kind of makes you wonder, what do I do with that? What questions to ask?
Does everybody know the difference between orientation and swarming? If you don't, Google it and look at pictures of what it looks like, because I've had so many new beekeepers call me and say, I think my bees are swarming. And they send me pictures and I go, no, relax. They're just orienting to that hive. The first day the bees change from house bees to foragers, they go up the front of the hive, they back off, and they kind of go back and forth. Okay, that's my hive. I'm in a yellow and white box. Okay, I'm going back home now. The next day they come out and they go around a little bit and they get oriented to the big trees and things like that. By the third day, they've seen a little dance in there and they know exactly distance and direction to go to get their forage. So make sure that you know the difference. It's huge how many new beekeepers call me panicked. It's very easy to tell the difference once you've seen it. So Google it. You'll be happy you did.
I was out on my deck working today and I could hear the bees, and usually I don't hear them as much. I could hear them. They were buzzing and I thought, uh-oh, is somebody getting ready to swarm? And I went out there and I kept looking. I kept going over there to look, and I didn't see, piles of bees. Generally you get a bunch of them like bearding and hanging off the hive before they go, and they're flying out further in the yard, and I didn't see any of that. I think what happened is we've had such a couple of cold, rainy days that the newbies have not gotten out to do the orientation flights like Kathy was talking about. So there was just a lot of them, and that can look like swarming.
I actually had a phone call today from a beekeeper and said, is this swarming? No, it's just orientation. So what Dawn said is really, really true. Make sure you know what it looks like, because it looks different than swarming. Swarming, the bees are in the air. They're not on the front of the box going back and forth going, hey, where am I living? Okay, that's it. So
And I
Yes.
put my supers on yesterday. You wanna put
Yay.
your supers on a few days before
Yep.
the blackberries actually bloom. So if you've got blackberries near you, now's the time.
I have
Mhm.
thornless blackberries. They're, you know, a hybrid, I believe, and they are always blooming 2 weeks before the Himalayan blackberries. And man, they are ready right now. So you know, you got a couple of weeks, maybe. I'm in a convergence zone, so I'm behind like Tracy and I'm behind West Seattle by a couple of weeks. So be ready. It's coming.
Well, and to top that off, we had a really good maple flow this year. The
Yes.
maple trees put out a lot of nectar, and there are some people. I have some frames that I have to pull and extract so they have room for the blackberry flow, and in a couple of the good hives. So they're starting out possibly already short on room. It's okay to go in if they have capped honey and extract that and put the frame back in. I do let. So yeah, I'm not going to go on.
I
So
almost
anyway.
never extract maple honey, but I'm gonna this year. I've got a couple of
Yeah.
hives just like that, Dawn, that I pulled out yesterday and went, wow, I don't have time to do this today, but I gotta go in there and extract that. So I was excited.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so thank you, Tracy. I always love your lessons. They're so good. We get these great conversations going. So moving on to the business part of the meeting, we have had a couple of events this month and they've gone really well. We love doing these events as a club. The first one we did was the Seattle TILF. And that is the edible plant sale that's in the Home of the Good Shepherd in Wallingford. And it was an all-day event. And I want to give a big shout out to Kathleen, who's here. Thank you, Kathleen. And Maureen supplied an observation hive. So there was a hive there that people could look at. And McClure helped out. And of course, Nancy was there. Nancy is our event person, always there helping out with honey sales. So the TILF fair went really well. And it was a beautiful sunny day. And then 2 weeks later, we had the West Seattle Bee Fair. And that is actually called a bee fair. So having us there is kind of a big deal because we are the local club. And it was just a few hours. So it's Saturday from noon to 3. And if you're ever in the area in the middle of May when that festival is going on, it's a lot of fun. Feel free to go by. Nancy was there. Anne McClure was there again, and Brian was there, who's here. Thank you, Brian, for coming and helping. I know you went over last minute to help with that. So yes, volunteers, thank you, thank you. And Nancy said that they sold 142 jars of honey in 2 hours.
Wow.
It does a very busy sales table. They must have just been hustling the whole time, and they could have sold more. They ran out. They ran out of honey after 2 hours, and the festival went on for a whole nother hour. So next year she'll bring, maybe 200 or 250 jars. Just so that you're aware, one of the things that we do as a club is we buy 5-gallon buckets of honey, and then we decant those out into pint jars. And we sell them at pretty close to cost. It's not a big money maker for us, but we sell them pretty close to cost just so that people have access to good local Washington honey that comes from a bee club. So we know we know the vendor that we get it from. And also there's a lot of different flavors there. So I've actually bought our honey before because it's really fun to try some of the different flavors. There's a creamed honey and wildflower honey, which is usually blackberry. Sometimes there's like a knotweed or some other fun flavors of honey. So it's kind of neat to get them and try different kinds. So if you go to the meeting live, which I encourage you to do in the Arboretum, the honey is always for sale there. Let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about current happenings in your bee yard. Let me make sure I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page. We have upcoming events. So the events that are coming up are all in the apiary. So we've got our apiary up and moving, and we're really excited to be having hive side lessons where you can show up and actually get into a hive. So the apiary update is that 3 packages were installed a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, and there's 2 Langstroths, because I think most people run Langstroth, and then we also have a top bar hive out there because we have a top bar expert in our group. So it's kind of fun to have somebody that knows about that and actually can learn about how to run a different kind of hive, because it really is, there are things that are very, very different about running different styles of hives. At the second Saturday after the hives were installed, Maureen, who is our apiary manager, found that one of the Italian queens had really spotty brood pattern. She just was not building up. There was, compared to the other 2 colonies, she was not building up very well. And there was lots and lots of gaps between the brood. And so this is a really good example of why, one of the things why it's good to have at least 2 colonies, because then you have a comparison point. You can see that one is building up 2, 3, 4 frames of brood, and the other is just this kind of small dwindling colony. And so she was able to compare those 3 and see that one of them was significantly behind. And this is one where you could, if you wanted to, you could donate a frame of brood to it. But sometimes a spotty brood pattern like that just kind of tells you there's something else going on with the queen. The times when you want to donate brood to another colony is when you've got a queen with a good brood pattern. They just can't grow enough. You kind of have to have enough bees to get a positive buildup going. Otherwise, they get a negative cycle and they just dwindle down. It takes 11,000 bees to keep house, just to keep house, to raise enough brood to make foragers. 11,000 bees is about 3 pounds. It's what you get in a package or in a nuke. So if you have a hive that has less than that and they're not building up, and you've got a queen with a good brood pattern, then that one could be a candidate for donating some brood to. So Maureen had some queens on order from Old Sol. They were already on order because she wanted to get a different kind of queen than just the ones that came up from California. And I think she was planning on maybe making a split with one of them, but in this case, it's a rescue queen. And Old Sol is a breeder that's been around for a long time, does really good Northwest stock. And so she pulled that queen that was failing 3 days before she picked up the Old Sol queen. And then by that time, the bees have realized that they don't have a queen and they're really hungry for a queen. And so then she put that new queen in and they were thrilled. They were all over that cage, dipping their heads in, trying to feed her, not looking like they're trying to sting her. And so the queen was accepted and they went ahead and released her the next day. Now, if you do need a queen, Old Sol is a good place, and also our vendor list that's on our website. A lot of our vendors, even if they've sold all of their nukes and packages, can still have queens because they breed queens sometimes all year long. We're going to hear tonight about the economics of queen replacement and why we need to sometimes breed queens all year long. So our upcoming apiary days are Saturday, May 27th and Saturday, June 24th. And those are those I'm planning on being at those also. So I would love to have you come out and at Hiveside and pull some frames and talk about what we see on them. You don't have to be just a beginner to show up. You can be an intermediate or an advanced person, because part of what we do is we talk and we mentor, and there's a really nice banter that goes on, kind of like what Kathy and Tracy and I had going a few minutes ago. It's really nice when you get a number of experienced people kind of playing off of each other and adding comments. You get a really great educational experience. So if you have experience and you want to practice mentoring, or you just want to come and help out in the apiary, we would love to see you there. It's limited to 20 people, but that doesn't seem to be a problem. We often don't get 20 people signed up. And if you really, really, really want to come and it's full, then I think you can make a call and we can get you in. So the sign up for the Hive days is on the web page in the calendar. And I'm going to drop some links in like I usually do in chat, so that you can see them and pick them up there. And for those of you in the room, Brian, if you could open the chat when I paste those in, then they'll be able to see them on the screen and type those in and find those links if needed. So I'm going to have a link to the sign up for Hive Check Day there. So come on out, have fun. It's always a lot of fun. And then there's another fun opportunity coming up. Washington State University is really active in bee rearing here in Washington State. They're kind of our most active university that helps us out. They have a new bee lab in Othello, Washington. And Othello, Washington is kind of way down in the northeast corner of Washington State, where it's nice and warm there, which bees love, but there's not as much forage. So I think they wind up feeding the bees a little bit more, but they raise a lot of bees there, a lot of hives for experiments. And they're having a class in June. Let's see, what day was it? Is June. Oh, I'll find the date. It's the middle of June. It's 2 days. It's a Friday and a Saturday in the middle of June. And what it is you get to go and you get to hear some of the really what I call the big kids. You get to go hang out with the big kids of the bee world here in Washington State. And you don't have to be super experienced to do this. Maybe, a year or more experience, you can go. But they're going to talk about queen rearing. So it's a class on queen rearing, which is after you've had a year or two of beekeeping experience, learning how to rear your own queens is a really, really valuable thing in understanding your bees and also continuing to requeen. So they will be teaching about setting up cell builders, which is a really fat, healthy hive that has enough bees in it to feed a queen cell. They get fed 1,000 times a day. Every queen cell gets fed 1,000 times a day. You need a lot of bees in there for that. They're going to talk about queenless and queen right rearing systems. And Sue Kobe is going to do an example of instrumental insemination. And she is one of the stellar people in Washington State as far as bee research and bee breeding. She is the person who actually developed the New World carniolan bees. So she's kind of a rock star in Washington State. So to actually see her work her microscope and talk about how they pull the semen off of the drone and inseminate the queens, it's just fascinating listening to her. So the instructors, if you don't know these names, the further you get into beekeeping, the more you'll learn about them here in Washington State. So the instructors are Sue Kobe and Brandon Hopkins, who is a great speaker. He's really a nice guy. Steve Shepard is the guy who has run the program at WSU, the bee program, for a very long time, and he's very knowledgeable. John Jacob, Nick Nager. Nick Nager is a crack up. He's really fun to listen to. And Jennifer Hahn will be there. And I don't know if you've seen that science experiment. There's a video out there where they are trying to find a fungus to kill varroa mites. And that is actually Jennifer Hahn's work. And so if you go there, she might actually do that presentation. It's pretty cool. She talks about how a mushroom lives in a cold temperature and a bee lives in a warm temperature, but they found a mushroom fungus type thing that will kill a varroa mite. So how do you get that to live in a warm hive, right? So they would go through and they would inoculate the hive at hive temperature, which wiped out almost all the fungus except a few. And they would harvest those and they would grow those and they would put it back in and again pull out the survivors until they found about 50% of the spores survive. So they're really trying to find something natural like that that will help us with varroa mites. And it's pretty fun to hear her talk. Let's see here. We are ahead of time. Let's see. I wanted to talk about next week's video. I'm sorry, next month's meeting. Next month's meeting is in a format that's a panel. So we're going to have a group of beekeepers from our club who are experienced beekeepers. And what we do is we just kind of set up a panel where you can ask questions, and then we go into breakout rooms. And the breakout rooms have specific topics like swarming or queen rearing or things like that that you think are interesting, and you can go from room to room. It's a really great time to ask questions in a small format, conversational way. And you just learn so much, and just getting to hear other people's questions and answers is a great learning experience. So it's kind of one of my favorite ways that we do meetings. So that is next month. If there is a question that you really think would be fun to explore, why don't you drop it into chat, and we'll see if we can do a breakout room around it, something that you kind of wanted to learn about in depth. Is it queen rearing or long langs or top bars, things like that, something that interests you, and we'll make sure we get those breakout rooms open. Let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in our bee yards right now. I was in an apiary, not my apiary, about 30 minutes north, and it was just up near Bellingham, just past Bellingham. And we opened up the top on this hive, and somebody goes, "Oh, what's that?" And something skittered across the top of the lid. And it was a small hive beetle. It's the first one I've ever seen live in a hive. And you know it's a small hive beetle because they're about the size of a really fat grain of rice, and their antenna has little dingle balls on the end of it. They've got these little round dingle balls. Go ahead, Kathy, you want to say something? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm always on mute because I'm afraid my dog's going to bark and interrupt. Anyway, I have seen hive beetles. I did a talk several years ago for our club on hive beetles. Don't confuse them with sap beetles, which you'll see in your hive all the time. They're long and skinny. Hive beetles are fat, and that little ball that they have at the end of their antenna is a real telltale that that's what you've got.
Balls.
Yep. And they have so far
whatever you call those hair bands that you put on that have little dweebles on them. Yeah.
Right, exactly. and they're not surviving up here currently because of our winters. I started beekeeping in California, and they were everywhere. In my commercial operation.
And they are starting to survive up here. So there's a guy up in our area who's had them for 3 years now, and he hasn't brought in any from out of state. Yeah.
That's
so
scary.
he's had them for, yeah. And so they're actually doing a monitoring, a citizen science monitoring project so that people can report if they have hive beetle to see if they're really getting a significant threshold. The question is, are they surviving or are they thriving and expanding enough to cause us a problem?
Toby said, and I think she's talking about Danny, that he has found hive beetles in his colony.
Yeah.
So there's a slick trick with Swiffer pads, and you can put them on four corners, and the hive beetles go to them, and when they start scratching around in it, they get caught up in it and they die, and then you can just toss them out and put in new ones. And there are hive beetle traps.
I just bought a box of those for this apiary.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And there are traps that you can buy to put in there. So if you see them, do something right away, because they slime your honey and they make just a mess out of everything. And you just have to toss the stuff away. You can't fix it or clean it up or anything. So just be really aware of that. And it's a good idea to Google them so you know what they look like.
Yeah, and that's a really good recommendation. Go and take a look at what hive beetles look like, and also see if you can find a picture at what proportion it is to a bee cell, because they are pretty small. They're a little bit less, maybe they're about half the size of the opening of a bee cell. And like Kathy said, they lay their eggs inside of the honey, and it just wrecks your colony, and it's really, really annoying. It takes quite a few of them before it gets to that point. The bees don't like them either. They tend to chase them around the hive and try to chase them out of the hive, but they are really good at hiding in little corners. And so the bees have been seen actually chasing them into these oil traps or onto the Swiffer sheets, or they'll just kind of put them in beetle jail. A whole bunch of them will stand around the beetle and not let it go anywhere. So the
Dawn,
bees really don't. Yeah.
Toby just put in chat a link to Danny's information about hive beetles that they have out there. So everybody,
Oh, awesome.
thanks,
Thank
Toby.
you, Toby. Yes. Yeah, we love getting high quality information, and Danny is great. He's been out here to talk to us a couple of times. So I was trying to remember the name of the guy who is doing the Hive Beetle Watch program, and that's called Chris Looney. And I think he's out of the USDA, and he's doing a research on the hive beetles in our area. And we'll see if we can get him to come out and talk to us. It's pretty fun to hear about what the latest is on some of these pests. And then I want to talk just briefly about spring treatments for your varroa mites. Don't overlook or underestimate how important treating your bees or determining how many varroa mites you have in the spring is so important. Because what we're at now, if you visualize that curve, you know, every book you ever read shows the curve of bees and then the varroa mites getting to be more than the bees by the time we get to fall. The problem is by the time the varroa have built up that much, the bees are already sick. And that's what kills 85% of our colonies die from the effects of varroa and the diseases that they vector. So if you can knock the varroa down now with something really gentle, like if you've got a vaporizer, a couple of oxalic acid vaporizers, then you can avoid that really big bell curve of varroa later this summer. And a lot of times people think, well, I'm going to wait until the numbers go up in August. And then I'll knock them all down after the honey flow, and they'll be good for winter. But what you have to consider is when varroa make your bees sick, you've got an entire generation of sick bees in August. And they are feeding that next generation. And they don't do a very good job of it because they're so sick and emaciated themselves. So then that second generation is also compromised. It takes until the third generation of bees before you really have a strong, highly functioning hive again. And during that time, August through October, is when the bees need to be making winter bees. And that takes a lot of vitellogen and a lot of bee fat from really healthy bees in order to make winter bees. And of course, that is what the varroa goes for. The varroa feeds on the fat in the bees, and it causes them to age faster. And it causes them to not be able to nurse the other bees as well. So then if you're not getting very good winter bees made, what you're doing is you're going into winter basically with summer bees. You have bees that are going to live about 6 to 8 weeks before they die because they weren't able to get enough fat stores because the nurse bees were sick from varroa. They weren't able to get enough fat stores built up to actually live the 3 to 5 months that they need to be a winter bee. So it's really, really important to start staying on top of your varroa mites now. And also take into consideration that when I first started about 8 years ago, when you did a varroa mite test, they said, well, if you see about 5 mites, then it's time to treat. And that number now, a few years later, is down to 2 to 3 varroa is now the standard for when you treat. So that number is declining as we learn more about varroa and the really devastating effects that it has on our colonies. So don't be afraid to test and treat. And it's the single most important thing that you can do for the survivability of your colony. So that's all I'm going to talk about there. And then one last thing before we go to our speaker, I want to talk about feeding bees. We just had all of those dandelions out. As soon as the dandelions bloom, it's like, yay, spring is here. We know the bees are coming out because dandelions have pollen and nectar, which really is great for our early spring bees. The next thing that comes after dandelions is the buttercups. And so when we see a field of yellow right now, we're seeing a field of buttercups, and the bees don't forage on buttercups very much. They're toxic. And you might see a few of them on buttercups, but it's not a significant food source for your bees. So if you have new colonies and you see the buttercups, make sure you're still continuing to feed constantly and don't food out there. And if you have established colonies, when you go in and do your hive check, look at those frames and think, do I have enough nectar in here to get us to the blackberry bloom, which is fortunately early this year. Last year it was late, but just make sure that you've got enough food in there until the next flow. So with that, I'm gonna finish talking and I'm gonna introduce our speaker. So we have, I'm so excited about this speech. So we have Katie Lee, who is here, and she's from the University of Minnesota. And she is the Apiculture Extension Educator Coordinator for the University of Minnesota. And she's also in their Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. I hope I'm saying that right, Katie. And it's a lot of very long words. She has a master's degree and a doctorate in entomology, which is so cool. That's like that. That's dream stuff. You're doing amazing things. And she specializes in honeybees with a focus on varroa mites and metrics that indicate queen and colony health. She spent 6 years traveling the US, working with commercial beekeepers to see how their colonies are doing and to help the Bee Informed Partnership. And if you haven't looked up the Bee Informed Partnership, Google that also. They are doing fantastic work to help us learn how to combat varroa mite and combat queen loss. And she currently keep about 200 colonies for research, which is an impressive number. I hope you have helpers. That's a lot of colonies. You got undergrads to help. And then right now, it sounds like you're developing educational resources for beekeepers, and you're doing a little bit of research on your own, and you're on the board of some associations, which we appreciate. You're a volunteer like all of us, and you also volunteer on the Bee Informed Partnership. So that is really an amazing set of credentials, and you're here to talk about the economics of queen replacement. And it's all yours, Katie.
Well, thanks, Dawn. Thank you so much for having me. I actually went out and talked to the Puget Sound group back in 2016. I actually flew out and got a tour around kind of the Seattle area. And it was the first time I've ever been there, and everybody was just so kind, and I really enjoyed my visit. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group again. So I'm just gonna share my screen and launch into it then. Okay. Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see the full thing, or do you see kind of the side part of it?
We see the side part.
Okay.
It's
one
not on slideshow.
1 second. There we go. Oh, does that work?
No, it says it's screen. Oh, there it is. Perfect.
Okay.
Before you had the main screen, and then you had all the pages, or whatever we're going to call them, on the side. Now you just have the main screen.
Okay, excellent. That is what I want. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of talk about a research project that I have going on. I no longer keep 200 colonies. That was for a research experiment, and I definitely did have a lot of helpers. The colonies were spread across 28 different locations, so it was a bunch of work. So I get to focus on a few different things now, including this project, which has been for the last 2 years. So I'm really interested in queens. I've done a lot with varroa, and to be honest, what Dawn said is super, super important about managing varroa, and that'll actually come up in this talk later. But I'm excited to be talking not about varroa as much as I used to as well, because sometimes it's just kind of depressing as well. But the 3 main contributors to a healthy colony, and this has gone over quite a bit tonight, really are a healthy laying queen, adequate amounts of food, in particular good diverse diet, not contaminated with pesticides, and low varroamite levels. So the thing I'm going to really address today is looking at the healthy laying queen. And so the question really is, like, before we really dive into it, what does healthy mean? What is a healthy queen? And these are just sort of the general rules that go through my head when I think about it. One, that queen is really laying eggs when she should be, you know, so not in the middle of winter, but just, you know, throughout the summer, throughout the entire bee season, she's laying eggs in kind of a nice, generally in a nice kind of regular pattern. She's generally young, although I'll talk a little bit about how that can fluctuate, because older queens can also be healthy. She has more than 3 million sperm stored in her spermatheca, which is this organ kept inside of her body where she stores her sperm after mating for the rest of her lifetime. And I kind of love the story behind how they figured out 3 million sperm. It was this paper done by this guy Woki, who I'm probably saying his name wrong, back in about like 1969 or so, where he would sit out in front of a colony and then watch queens go out and mate and then watch them come back. And then if they went out on a second mating flight, he'd actually catch that queen at the entrance and then dissect her and open up her spermatheca and count the amount of sperm in there, because the new sperm hadn't migrated yet. So she would go out and take a second flight if it was about 3 million sperm. And so that's sort of how that's been judged. Also, those sperm in there, they should be alive. So they should have a high viability, meaning that few percent should be actually dead in there and most of them should be alive. In general, low pathogens, that's kind of obvious. And a pheromone profile, so her smell should kind of reflect her actual quality, so the bees kind of know how she's doing. And then obviously good genetics too, in particular, mating with more drones, minimum of 10, but preferably more, that are genetically diverse. And this has been shown to really help with colony health long-term, this genetic diversity. And so with beekeepers, what we want to do is really understand the cases where this is not true, which is is relatively difficult, because then we want to identify and replace any unhealthy queens. So these are, when I used to go out and work with commercial beekeepers, I worked with about 75 or so, and it was like the best job ever, because what I got to do is just travel around the country and dig through people's bees and then talk to people about what they were doing and what they were concerned about and what was going well. And one of the things that constantly came up in conversations was people were really concerned about the quality of their queens. And there's been some talk about if queen supersedure is higher than it used to be. Honestly, nobody really knows, because it necessarily wasn't recorded in the past all that well, or kind of not consistently where we can really understand if this is like a relatively new problem or something that's been going on for a long time. But when I did talk to beekeepers, they were still concerned about queen health because it is a major contributor to colony health. Even if it's not new, it still is a big contributor. And these are sort of the signs that they listed, what they thought were attributed to a failing queen. And I'm going to point out that these may or may not be attributable to the queen. We did a different study that looked at the last one of brood pattern, and sometimes it was due to the queen and sometimes it was more due to some of the colony conditions. But in general, these are what they look for in signs that the queen was doing well or not. So looking for supersedure of an apparently healthy queen, supersedure and then failure to actually raise a new queen. Young queen stops working or stops laying but is not replaced by workers. Queen laying on relatively few number of frames, and the colony isn't growing compared to surrounding colonies. And obviously drone layers are very much a queen problem. And sometimes people attributed it to things like chalk brood as well. I'm kind of listing these because I just want to kind of demonstrate how difficult it is to really identify what a failing queen is, because these could really be due to some different colony conditions as well. I'm just going to point out my picture up there. That is a dead queen with a retinue. This was just a very unlucky happenstance where we were collecting samples for Varroa and a single drop of alcohol fell in the colony, and the queen, of course it hit the queen, not our colony either, and she died. And so that's what that picture is. But she's failed for a non-queen reason. But the reason why people talk about what failing queens look like, or what they think they look like, is they really want to be able to identify when there is an issue, because then they can go in and replace the queen to kind of prevent some of the issues that can come up. Because when a queen does die, or there are issues in a colony, then it can be risky for either the colony to replace a queen or the beekeeper to replace a queen. And which can eventually lead to colony death if that doesn't happen. This is a picture I took in a different colony of two virgins, well, one live virgin emerging and the other has already been killed by other queens. So this one had a bunch of virgins emerging. But that's kind of an example of one way it can be risky. But obviously getting a new queen in there, you want a new queen that is healthy and reproductive. Okay, so the question sort of is does replacing queens each year actually help prevent some of these queen failures and subsequent colony losses? So this is kind of the stem of this question about what the decision to requeen really means down the line for the colony. And so what this is Zach Browning, who's a commercial beekeeper in North Dakota. And he expressed a lot of interest in this kind of question. And so we collaboratively wrote a grant to Project Apis M, which is one of my favorite grantors besides the one I work for. And we got funded. And so, yeah, so this project is really a collaborative effort with this beekeeper. And what our objectives were to basically put a cost on queen replacement, put a dollar amount on the decision to replace a queen or not within his operation. And then to look at the supersedure rate in these commercial colonies and determine the amount of queen loss. And if we could actually tell if it was associated with either colony metrics or queen metrics. In his operation, there's sort of two reasons why they keep old queens. One is because essentially she just looks too good to really replace. Healthy pattern, really great pattern, honestly. And colony looks really healthy. And then the other reason is just straight up logistics. They just can't get around to all of the colonies that they have. So we looked at both of these, the first one in 2021 to 2022, that bee year, and the next one just this past year of 2022 to 2023. And I get this question a lot because I know this work is done in a commercial beekeeping operation. So I just want to kind of explicitly say why I think this is still interesting to small scale beekeepers. One, it's because all beekeepers need to make the choice to replace a queen or not each year. And this project can really help demonstrate where some of that risk is in terms of time and management during the year. And, you know, sometimes we get the question about why we choose to work with larger scale beekeepers instead of smaller scale beekeepers. And honestly, it's in large part just because of numbers. There are so many variables in the way people keep honeybee colonies that working with a commercial beekeeper, at least all the management is the same from your location to location. So it's a way to have really large numbers of colonies. We use 240 for both years of this experiment. And then so we can track that many colonies and kind of reduce some of the numbers of variables. So I'll go through some of the things, but I do still think this is super interesting. Maybe I'm just a nerd, but I think this is super interesting information because we see all these questions all the time. People are always asking what supersedure rates are and what colony survival is over time and what to expect. Okay, so I'm going to kind of dive into some of the methods. For the first year, I kind of talk about the first year first, so 2021, 2022. What we did was follow the beekeeper around as they made decisions about whether or not to replace a queen based on how she looks. And then we followed these colonies over time. Throughout the summer, really like our season kind of ramps up in June in kind of the upper Midwest area with kind of honey production. Colonies are generally split in March, April, get new queens, kind of brought up to North Dakota in May, June, and then are up here throughout the summer, and they'll extract and pull honey supers throughout August. And then our fall really hits in September or so. And this beekeeper brings his colonies out to sheds in Idaho and then out to California to pollinate almonds. So following those colonies throughout the entire bee year for his operation. So out in North Dakota is really where the first year of this study started, where we followed colonies in 6 different sites, each kept 40 colonies in each of those apiaries. So in May of 2021 is when they put new queens in these colonies in particular out in North Dakota. And again, we followed the beekeeper as they were making those decisions. And if the brood area looked great, queen was laying really well, colony looked healthy, the beekeeper decided to keep those queens, and we made sure to mark all of those queens. And we also clipped a wing only to make sure if that paint mark fell off, then we would be able to identify that queen still, because she would have that little wing clipped. And if the brood pattern was just okay, like it wasn't terrible or anything, but just not, it didn't wow anybody, they decided to replace that queen. And then those colonies got a new queen from one of 3 mated queen sources. And overall, they kept 48 queens and then replaced 180 queens essentially. I'm going to point out here that we don't really know the exact definition of old in this scenario, except for like a handful of those queens, because a handful did have paint marks on them. But these could have been supersedure queens sometime before, like during the last summer or something. So they might not have all been the same age, which is something we did control for in the second year. And the new queens, I just want to point out, were really evenly distributed across those 6 different yards. So each of those queen sources came in a shipping box. So we had 3 different shipping boxes. And all of those queens that were put into colonies each came from like just a single shipping box. So they were all in a single cohort. And I pulled 15 of each of those different queens and shipped them straight to North Carolina State University, where David Tarpey has a queen and disease clinic that actually will dissect the queens and then do different measures on them. So look for how well those queens are mated. So number of sperm, sperm viability, and then different pathogens as well, just to look at the differences among those different queen lines. I also took 15 of the old queens and had them processed as well. Okay, so they went through the colonies, they either kept or replaced that queen. And when they introduced that new queen, they fed it sugar syrup, put the queen cage between brood. And then in 10 days after that, we went back and did what we call checkbacks, just to make sure that those queens took or not. And if the queen didn't take, if she wasn't in there, and like in this colony, these are not swarm cells, these are actually supersedure cells, or sorry, emergency cells. It made a big smile. This was one of my favorite pictures I took that year. They were really into making a new queen in this colony. So if they didn't take, like in this colony, we gave them a new queen from that exact same cohort with another frame of open brood, just to try to help that acceptance. Okay, and then we went through and recorded data. So introduced queens in May, came back, did checkbacks, and then came back in June, then August and September in North Dakota, and out in February in California and the almonds. And the most important metric that we looked for was queen status. So we were interested in seeing if it was the exact same queen or not. So we looked for that little paint dot, which our paint was good and it stayed on. So we didn't have to find as many with just the clipped wings. If it's the same queen or a new queen, and this is a cell of, you can see how the queen chewed her way out of the bottom of that cell and emerged. You can see that kind of frayed edge and the little cap coming off under the new queen. And if that queen wasn't there, we recorded what was going on. And any new queens that we found that were laying, we did the exact same thing, painted them a different color and clipped their wing, and then followed those queens over time as well. We recorded a bunch of other data to go with it, like different health metrics, looked at frames of bees, assessed kind of a count of frames of bees, assessed the brood pattern, looked for any pests or pathogens, looked for any queen cells that we could find in the colony as well. And then made sure all brood stages were present. So eggs, larvae, pupae. We also took samples for Varroa in June, August, and September. And then also the beekeeper was really interested in looking at comparing the old queen colonies with the new queen colonies in reference to deformed wing virus. So we took samples to measure deformed wing virus in 4 yards as well. Okay, so getting into just a few of the results. We looked at queen acceptance in May. So when we did checkbacks, this is sort of the results from that for the percentage of queens that took or not. So the non-acceptance of the queens, the mated queens that we put in had a fairly wide range of 7% non-acceptance, so 93% accepted, to 20% non-accepted, so 80% accepted. This was totally confounded by queen cage type, because each seller sent them in different types of queen cages, which would be kind of fun to play with at some point, but not in this project. So on the second round of colonies, when we put in a new mated queen from that same cohort, 43% of those were not accepted. So this was roughly about a little bit better than just a coin toss about whether or not that queen was accepted. So either beekeeper could perhaps change a few management practices for how you introduce queens into those colonies, or honestly, some kind of, I haven't done the economic analysis for whether or not it would be worth it to try to accept a call, try to put a colony, a queen back in the same method. Okay, so these are the results from the North Carolina disease and queen clinic, looking at how well those different queens were mated. So source 1 was mated, was quite well mated on average. Down to the old queens had only 2.2 million sperm on average. And really, we kind of expected this anyways, because those queens were expected to be older, and so they were using up their live sperm over their lifetime. And then you can see also the percentage of queens that were poorly mated. And in the new mated queen lines, that ranged from 7% to 33%. Had fewer than 3 million live sperm, and so those were considered to be poorly mated. So that also varied quite widely. The majority, 80% of the old queens had fewer than 3 million sperm, although probably when they were mated, this number would have been much lower. So a higher percent would have been considered to be well mated. But again, they're using up their sperm, so this is also sort of what we would expect. Okay, so we followed these queens over time, and so what this chart shows is the colonies with those original queens after May. In June, this basically lists the percent of colonies where we had found the original queen in those colonies. And you can see for 2 of the new queen sources and those old queens, they're right around 85 to 88%. But that first line, the source 1, we actually only found 13% of the same queens in those colonies, which was, I lost a little sleep over that one because I thought I had done something wrong, but I recorded everything and that's just what it was. So these ones were accepted really, really well when I did checkbacks. So they were in there and laying 10 days after being introduced. But somehow from that date I did checkbacks to the date that we assessed them in June, they died or were rejected by the colony for some reason. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But this was a very surprising result for me. Although talking to beekeepers, it does happen on occasion, and it was just real. So it was just unfortunate, in particular for both the beekeeper and the queen supplier that happened to be part of this study. But overall, I think it's pretty interesting to see how well those queens survived over time. And then all the way to February. And you can see that queen source 3 did the best, where we found 75% of those queens again, all the way through to February. And once the queens from queen source 1 died, once those other ones had gone, the other ones pretty much hung on. So yeah, the old queens, we did find 63% out in February, which was interesting. So overall, throughout the summer, each and every colony that died throughout the summer in this study, I could trace back to a queen issue. Everyone had either before the colony died, either was trying to raise a new queen, had a drone layer, had something else going on with their queen. And so that was pretty clear about the importance of the queens on those colonies' health. For honey production, because one of the metrics we measured was we weighed each honey super from each individual colony. The old queens just made just as much or more honey compared with the new queens. I do want to point out that these colonies were just not randomly chosen. One of the reasons why the beekeeper tended to choose these colonies is that they tended to be just a little bit larger in May and June, and just kept on, producing new bees and didn't get any brood breaks. So they were really pumping out bees. So this might be part of the reason why. So this year also was interesting because the mite levels were basically non-existent. Only 10 colonies out of 640 samples that we processed had more than 2 mites per 100 bees. And they weren't all in one queen source or anything. It just was very, very low mites throughout the entire year. And likewise, for the deformed wing virus, which was a little, it was a little disappointing to have such low mites, because then we couldn't really look at the foreign wing virus because that was also super low. So we couldn't really say much about that stuff, but it was interesting nonetheless because of what the implications are for colony mortality down the line. And here's the colony mortality. So you can see for summer colony mortality for queen source 1, because of all of those queen source issues, was 25%. And overall, they had the highest mortality throughout the year at 32%. Versus you can see how low the overall mortality was of these other lines. And even the other 2 new mated queen sources had 0 winter mortality, possibly in large part due to just how low the mite levels were over the winter, which was what Dawn was talking about earlier. The old queens had a little bit higher, at 17% compared to the two other queen source lines, but still overall, I think that's pretty low as well. Okay, you don't have to try to read what I have in that bottom graph. I just was really interested in looking at kind of comparing the income and expenses to these different queen lines and the old queens. It just happened to be that this year the old queens had the highest income, with the two new queen sources without the problem being pretty close behind. And really the main difference was due to that buying the new queens, that queen cost. The queen colonies, the colonies with source one queens that had the really major queen issue in June made 3 times less essentially than those old queens, and made, you know, pretty much like a bit more than 2 times less than the new queen sources. So just as a summary, overall, old queens in this study were basically just as productive as new queens, looking at honey and also looking at frames of bees and almonds, which I did not talk about here. But that winter mortality kind of alluded to some of that because the colonies need to be alive in order to rent them out for almond pollination. But so for both of those, they actually performed really quite well for the old queens. And in part because they didn't have the same expenses of purchasing those new queens. Again, though, the old queens were not randomly chosen, and there's a question about what old really means here. And a major caveat is that this is only a single year. I do want to point out there's this really interesting beekeeper in Illinois named Charles Linder. He writes an article for, I think, the American Bee Journal about his operation a lot. He ran a very similar experiment to mine, but just not marking individual queens and finding all of those queens, but he followed lines over time. And he also found that his old queens were performed just as well as a lot of his new queen lines, and that he also had similar batch issues like I had in that one queen source one. Okay, this is my team. We repeated this study in 2022 and 2023. I just want to kind of give a shout out because we patiently went through each and every colony, each and every session, and found every single queen. And if we couldn't find her, we came back to the yard. So they were awesome and were a ton of fun to work with. Okay, so in this past year, what we did is very similar kind of thing. And I really wanted to get queens from the exact same 3 queen sources that we used in year 1. But that was not possible due to how fast the almonds bloomed. And so how quickly that beekeeper needed to split. So those queens from those sources just were not ready yet, except from one. So this year we actually ended up using queen cells along with mated queens, which I was all right with because I was pretty curious anyways to kind of compare those groups. So what we did this time is, because I didn't know who those old queens were in the first year, we ended up using queens from that first year in the second year because I knew all about them. I had data, I knew who they were, I knew their origin, I knew exactly how old they were, I knew how they performed. So we used old queens, 24 queens from line 2 and 24 queens from line 3. And we knew, like, we made sure that those old queens are in there to start with those original paint marks. I went out to California in March with the beekeeper as they were requeening. And so the bottom left picture is one of the split colonies that they were making up out there. And each of those colonies received a new queen source from one of 2 mated queen lines, and then one of 2 queen cell lines. And for the mated queens, I paint marked them out in California, out in this little cage in the field. It's like 20 beekeepers were waiting on me. So I'm sitting there marking each individual queen and clipping her wing. just sitting out in the grass. And then I couldn't obviously mark the queens that were in the cells. And so I didn't mark them until they got back up to North Dakota and moved out into their individual yards. But we did 48 from each of these different lines, and every queen source was really spread out evenly. Is there a question? Somebody just popped up. Okay. If there's ever a clarification, excuse me, question where I didn't quite explain things well enough, you feel free to just interrupt me as I'm talking, because I'm sure other people would also have the same exact question. So just let me know. So, okay, so everything equal across all the different yards this time around with the different queen sources, including the old queens, and knew who they all were, used the exact same yards. So what happened is the queens were out in California, got introduced, the queen cells made it out there. Everything got shipped back to North Dakota into one big yard where I sat there and went through each colony and saw if it was queen right or not. I marked about 25 to 50% extra just in case for any that didn't make it as well. And then because in these giant yards, these colonies, kind of some of the bees drift, we ended up also equalizing the colonies in June. So moving around frames of bees so they were about the same size. And then went through and did the same kind of looking for the queen and counting up these colony metrics as well. Okay, this is the holding yard out in California. It held about 1,000 colonies. And again, in June, these colonies, as you can see, there might be some drifting bees out here due to some of and creating some colony size differences. But this is where they were and where they mated. I collected 12 queens from those mated queen sources out in California in March and shipped them off to the same disease and queen clinic. And then once in May, when the colonies were up in North Dakota, I collected the 12 from each of the 2 lines of queen cells as well. So I wanted to make sure to get those ones for how well they had mated out in that holding yard. Okay, just what I said, mated queens pulled in March, queen cells pulled in May. And these are the results from that. They were on average mated about the same. And then the colonies, the mated queens were about 18% were considered polarly mated, and about 25% of those queens that came out of cells were considered to be poorly mated. And so I went through all of the colonies that we tagged out in California. So these aren't all included in the experiment, but I really wanted to know once they got up to North Dakota, what percentage of those colonies were queen right. And so for those queen cells, about 80% or so were queen right up in North Dakota, meaning about 20% of those queens those queen cells didn't take. And for the mated ones, it was 91 or 97%, so a bit higher there. Of those are queen right. And then over time, these are the percent of colonies with the original queen. And I kind of have them color coded because I find it easier to look at. But for the queen cells, I had those 2 different lines. I just labeled them A and B. I have no idea if that queen actually came from that cell or if the colony raised a new queen, because I just wasn't able to do checkbacks in time to really make sure that that queen that was in there is actually from the cell or not. But we first marked those queens in June for whatever was in there, and then followed them over time. So these are the percent of colonies with the original queen. You can see old mated 2 really held on, which was pretty impressive until February. But this is actually because a huge percentage of those colonies died of varroa. Which I'll show in a minute here. But in general, fairly similar numbers. Queen cells did a bit worse than the mated, and then the older queens did a bit worse than that. Okay, these are the honey production. The older queens did a bit worse than the rest of the sources. Everything else was about equal. And this was probably in part because of colony size. And then also varroa levels for that queen source too. But everything else was about the same. Queen source D did the best. And this was the true kind of lesson for this year. So on the far left there, you can see the mated queen sources, source 2 and source 3. This mated queen source 2 was just total mite candy this year. Those older queens really had a lot of mites in them. This source 3 is actually a line that's bred for varroa sensitive hygiene. So while they were kept right next to each other, were the same age throughout the year, they really didn't have the same mite levels as that number 2 group. And actually this queen source 3 is also bred for varroa sensitive hygiene, and they also had really low levels. The other mated source D did pretty well, and then the queen cells, for some reason, just, I don't know what happened there. They started out with higher mite levels and ended with higher mite levels, but I don't think it was necessarily because of they came from cells. I think it was just luck of the draw for those ones. But yeah, that was a little frustrating. I did want to point out that equalizing may have done some damage through mite spread, because the donor frames, the colonies that received frames, weren't necessarily more likely to have higher mites in August. But 12 frames from those old source 2 colonies, so 12 colonies donated frames of brood, and on average those colonies had over 7 mites per 100 bees, and so there's no way that they didn't affect the colonies that received them. Okay, and here you can look at winter mortality again, summer, winter, and then total colony mortality over the year. Summer mortality was pretty low. Old mated 3 had the highest level, and again, that was primarily because of queen loss. You can see how much higher the winter mortality was this year, and it really corresponds to how high those mite levels were in those individual colonies. Those old mated 2, source 2 colonies that were the total mite candy had 0 summer mortality, but 63% winter mortality. And I think that that says a lot. The 2 mated sources with really low mite levels had 6 or 10% winter mortality. And then the cells with the higher mite levels tended to have between 30 and 38% mortality. So over winter. So yeah, so quite a different year in terms of mortality and the reasons why. Income and expenses, because so many died of mites and did not make very much honey. They did a lot worse in the second year of this study. Those old queens did. They made less than half the money of the three of the new queen lines. So just a few caveats. There's lots and lots of potential variability in here. This is just one set of outcomes in one commercial operation, and really every year can be quite different. And these results are somewhat preliminary still. I'm still kind of looking through some of the data. I think some of the main takeaways were part of the thing that's interesting is the variability and how much that can be for both the years and the queen sources, which is maybe a little disconcerting if you're a beekeeper, but I think it's important to keep in mind. I think it's interesting to keep old queens, but really to keep an eye on them for mite levels, because they can perform well, but really eliminating those mites in those colonies are important. Summer losses were mostly due to some queen issues. And really it can be due to either the queen or colony conditions. I focused on the ones that were the queen herself, but there's lots of reasons why queens can fail. In the winter losses in the last year was really due to Varroa. Okay. Dawn, how much time do I have left? Oh, it's okay. I have more of my talk, but if
About 20 minutes, sorry, about 20
okay, good.
minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, sir. No worries. Thank you. Okay, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what happened with that 2021, that one queen source where a lot of those queens failed. I found it to be like a total mystery and talked to a bunch of different beekeepers about why this would be, and nobody really had an answer that would really work. And honestly, there were no issues. The beekeeper got queens from that exact same supplier later in the year without any issues at all. Those queens took fine. And so it looked like it really was perhaps an issue with that batch or with that particular shipment. And it was impossible for me just to tell something was wrong. The queens, by looking at them, I handled all of the queens. I handled the other lines as well when we marked them and clipped those wings. So I had a lot of exposure to them, but I have no idea. They were moving around fine. There was nothing unusual, just visually. And in this case, for the beekeeper, it would have been more of a much less expensive. I was almost going to say a bit more of a blessing if they just showed up dead instead of just damaged and were going to fail. I was so excited because I had sampled those 15 queens out of that exact same cohort and had them at the Queen and Disease Clinic at North Carolina State University. But nothing panned out there. They were really well mated. They looked great, had great sperm viability, low pathogens. I looked at vitellogenin, which is the storage protein, which can be an indicator of bee health. I actually also asked them to look for cold stress genes because I spoke with the queen breeder that shipped these queens, and they thought it was cold in North Dakota that day. So they thought that that was a possibility, but nothing showed up there, although that's not super unusual because those queens actually ended up being banked for 3 weeks as well. So something else could have happened. So they were actually banked in their box for 3 weeks, but all of them were, which is also kind of incredible. So nothing I looked at is source one wasn't different. And if anything, it was slightly better. Just briefly to linger on the cold damage. So there is a paper by Alison McAfee that looked at how exposure to different temperatures can affect sperm viability. But so cold can actually damage sperm viability if you keep them at cold for too long. But these queens actually had great sperm viability. So there was no evidence of that here. So it was really cold. They were banked. I have no idea what happened. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's worth looking at, even if it was a fluke, because then if we know, then it would be preventable, hopefully. And in general, I think it's really interesting kind of to look at what could be done to really help queen success. Because it is really hard to tell on the beekeeper end about what you're getting. So we can look at different things about what affects queen acceptance, supersedures, and try to mitigate the different causes that are out there, like handling of queens. That is what ended up being the issue with queen source one. And so like queen breeders, I know the ones I know try to really do their best for keeping queens healthy and going through the whole process and take a lot of pride in that. And then on the beekeeper side, like what can we do to handle queens and make sure they're introduced correctly, just to give them the best chance, although sometimes obviously it's a bit out of our hands too. And I focused a lot on the queen herself in this scenario. But I just want to bring up how queen acceptance can also be due to colony condition or influenced by colony condition. And I keep talking about this study because I think it's really great because it's done by a master beekeeper in North Carolina in partnership with David Tarpey as well and Brad Metz, who runs the Queen and Disease Clinic. And they have had like a lot of issues out there with getting packages accepted or queens accepted when they put them into packages. So those queens get either rejected outright or rejected down the line. And so Eric Talley decided to look at if putting in either brood pheromone or a frame of brood, open brood, really helped queen acceptance in those colonies. And this is a graph. This is all information that's found. You can find online too. So his control was just hiving on essentially foundation, where red is rejected. So those colonies basically rejected those queens within about a week or so. And then black is superseded, where that's the percent of colonies. So it's 40%. It ended up being 40% for him. I can't remember how many weeks it was, but it was like something like 4 to 6 weeks or something out where those queens ended up being superseded. So you can see that's a huge number of package queens that have not been accepted for them. So the middle kind of bar there is the brood ester pheromone. So it's just the smell of brood and nothing else really, not the brood itself. And you can see that increased the number of queens that were accepted. And then just a frame of open brood itself really increased the number of queens that were accepted. And this could be due to other things like putting in a frame of like wax comb. We have some issues with packages, but not quite to this level. This is only like 30% of your queens from your packages survive, is pretty dismal. But I love this example because I think it's a super cool project where somebody showed something really practical about how people can get queens to be better accepted in packages. So sort of the point is that colony environment and or queen can really affect acceptance and supersedure. So ultimately the question then is like, so what do you do? Like as a beekeeper, what do you do? As I was talking about before, you can opt to save that old queen if you so wish. We often do it here when we make splits. We have what we call our parent colony, which has the old queen. And then the new colony, which gets a new queen. And if one of them doesn't take, then you can combine the two, or just split out into a nuke as well. And you can make 2 divides in a nuke, depending on if you're trying to grow or not the number of colonies you have. But I think it's interesting to save that old queen. And then, just treat queens with care, do, keep them out of the sun, keep them, room temperature, don't get them too cold. And be sure to prepare a colony to really accept a new queen. Young bees, incoming food, having brood present all increases those chances. And then monitor queens and replace queens if and when needed. If that colony just is not replacing a queen successfully, you may need to jump in and do some intervention there. Or if you get a drone layer or something like that as well. Manage mites, especially colonies with older queens. It can be more difficult to have treatments that really work well when there's so much brood and bees in that colony. And I think that's part of the reason why older queens tend to have higher issues with mites. I know this is just like one example of a single queen source with high mite issues. But in talking with lots of different beekeepers, they see more issues with mites in older queens than they do with newer queens. And then with that, thanks so much again for having me. And I can take any questions. My contact information is up there, and the link to the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. Okay. Yeah, Kathy?
I'm unmuting. So when you talk about old queens, I may have missed it, but how old do you consider an old queen?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean that's sort of the part of the question, right? Like,
yeah.
So the first year we didn't know how old they were. We just knew they originally came from the year previous. So in this kind of definition, the idea is that they're about a year old is considered older, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're old. Maybe I should just call them older queens rather than old queens.
Okay. Because what I've found in my apiary, I'm always trying to look at the genetics, and I had a 5-year-old queen that they superseded in winter, which, you know, meant the hive died. Luckily, I have a daughter, but she had the lowest mites in the entire apiary. She always had the biggest honey crop in the entire apiary. And I just, Tracy and I tease each other back and forth because she said, get rid of those old queens, you know, and I go, no, I just want to see what happens, you know. And then she would have been 5. And I had one that would have been 4 this year, and they superseded her right before the fall. But again, the lowest mites, the biggest honey crop, you know, just super brood patterns. And then one of the things I wanted to ask you about brood patterns is I have some queens that display, that I've been breeding down to, that display really good VSH qualities. And because the workers will tear open a pupa and pull that pupa out with mites and get rid of it, there are holes in the brood pattern. So the brood pattern may not look as delicious as a new queen that's laying side to side, and they don't have the same qualities. So is there any kind of consideration for which queens maybe had those traits, or it was just like not considered at all in your research?
Well, okay, so so I did a different study looking at brood patterns, which maybe I won't go into, but we like swapped queens and looked at if brood patterns change over time. Which in that case, it was more due to colony condition, but I think it kind of matters. I mean, one of those colonies, 2 years we had, this last year we had 2 lines of bees that were bred for VSH traits. We saw a lot of that uncapping. And one of those lines performed the best out of everything. Like it's not like we looked at, for the first year, the beekeeper went through and selected based on brood pattern. But in that case, hopefully there wouldn't be a whole lot of holes in that brood pattern, because when they start to open them up with those VSH, I mean, what they're doing for is really like hunting for mites and opening them up and stuff. But you can kind of tell when it's VSH-y, if that's a word, more like due to VSH, they do it in kind of clumps, like where it's together, versus like in that queen, like the line that also had like the super high mite levels, they also would open up cells, and you could open them up, remove the pupa, and then look and see the mite frass inside of that cell, and you know that there were mites in there. So they would also do that same behavior, but it was in a different pattern than the VSH groups. So I mean, first year we didn't consider the VSH when we selected some of the queens, although I know some of the ones that got into our like a good group were actually VSH because of how they were marked. But the second year, I mean, I knew who everybody was. We didn't pick based on brood pattern. Brood pattern was just what it was. Does that answer your question? I feel like I missed something there.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a new thing, and it's kind of hard to know all the answers, but I think that both Tracy and I are doing this and keeping daughters and, trying to proliferate that. And it's showing when I do mite counts that they just don't have the same numbers as other hives. For instance, I had someone who had a couple of hives, and she was in a homeowners association. It was swimming pools surrounding her, and she had to get rid of her bees. She said, "Just take them. I don't want any more to do with them. My neighbors are all up in arms." And so even after I had done mite treatment in the fall, her hives had numbers of like dropping in the 800 mites, where my old queens had 40. And it was just like shocking to me to see the difference, because I've been working with the same kind of genetics over and over the years and haven't really introduced too much new to them. So yeah, I'm very interested in your research. That was great. And do you see Marla very often?
All the time. Yeah.
I came back there in, I think it was either 2005 or maybe 6, and studied with her for a week. And I was fairly interested in propolis back then. And I just love to see that she's continued, because we had a few conversations about it. I love to see that she's continued with that. And I actually did my master paper on propolis and ways to make it cheaper for beekeepers rather than to have to cut up, little can't talk tonight. The little screens and put them on the sides. We found that the second best, hers was the best, but the second best was actually getting a little drill bit that was all these wires and roughing up the inside of the hives. And the bees just did an amazing propolis envelope. So
Yeah.
tell her I'm still following what she does. And she actually helped me with the paper. So she's a great gal. You're lucky to be there.
Yeah, I am lucky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm kind of curious about the colonies that you had trouble getting a queen twice. So you put one in, they kill her, put one in, they kill her, just not getting accepted. So then 50%, killing 2 queens and only having 50% the next time is a pretty determined colony. I'm wondering if it's race, possibly. And then also, what do you do with that colony then? Was a third time tried, or do you just combine it? And my concern with combining it is they might kill the queen in any hive you mix them with.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, it was frustrating. Yeah, the beekeeper tried to keep, well, after the second one, the beekeeper didn't try anymore. For those ones that rejected them, like it's like 40. It's not very good odds. Yeah, I sometimes there could be a virgin in there, and that if I was talking to somebody else, that's what I would tell them to look for. If like there's maybe another queen that they raised and they just won't accept yours. In this case, because I followed them again, that ended up not being the case for most of them. We did have 2 colonies reject queens because there was a second laying queen in those colonies, which is interesting. But that was also easy to tell, because when we went back in there, you saw the distribution of like brood, and that told you right away. Yeah, what do you do with those? Like, you could try to break them up. You could try to rebuild them. A lot of times what commercial beekeepers do is they keep 5-frame nukes on hand, and we'll just drop an entire nuke in there and sometimes call it a heart transplant, essentially, and rebuild a colony that way. And that often, that's honestly, if you can't get a colony to accept a queen, that works almost every time. But it's, if you can't have nukes on hand, 5-frame nukes, then it's hard. But yeah.
Thank you. That's a heart transplant. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I know. I love that. It's like, it's so like telling, I guess.
Also, did they make those hives hopelessly queenless before introducing eggs to make a new queen, or before introducing a queen cell or queen. You know, that could have a lot to do with it.
You mean, are you talking about laying workers, the hopelessly queenless? That's
No,
what we always say when it's
hopelessly queenless just means, you know, not having a queen for a decent amount of time before they go into making a queen cell or
Oh,
accepting a
yeah.
queen.
Yeah, like
Not
the
having,
age
not having
distribution
eggs,
gets,
so they don't have any way to make a queen. So if there's no young brood, then they're hopelessly queenless. Yeah.
okay. Okay, yeah, okay. When I think about it, it's like hopeless queenless to me means that you can never get a queen to be accepted. And sometimes that's because it, you know, like there's no brood. And sometimes like the age distribution just changes too much, maybe, and like the older ones just don't accept. But yeah, that makes sense where they can't raise one on their own.
Okay, we're pretty much at time. Is there any last questions? Going once, going twice. Katie, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. It's what great research, and I've learned a lot about queens and the economics of queen replacement. And now I'm going to be questioning those pros that replace their queens every year, because that's kind of what a lot of them do now. And you kind of said, well, you know, you could or you couldn't, you know, it was about the same is what I kind of got out of that. So that's really good information to give us something to weigh against when we hear what the pros are doing.
I feel like I just made it more confusing, honestly. You know, there's pros and cons of both. So yeah.
But you confirmed why they all have different opinions and why they can't agree on it, right? Because it is kind of one of those areas. And if it was really clear cut, then they would have stumbled across the answer, and then we'd be testing to see why the answer is true.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Katie. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you all. We'll see you next month, and have fun in the bees. We got some warm weather coming, and give your mentor a call if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Katie.
you.